Number 1. Ken Saro-Wiwa. We begin our descent into the darkest corners of government tyranny in the oil-rich swamps of the Niger Delta in Nigeria. The year is 1995. This is a story about the curse of black gold. It is a story about how the discovery of oil, which should have made a nation rich, instead turned its rivers into sludge, its air into poison, and its government into a murder machine. At the center of this tragedy stood a man who was not a soldier, not a rebel commander, but a man of words. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a writer, a television producer, a poet, and a voice for the voiceless Ogoni people. He was a small man, with a trademark pipe always clenched between his teeth, a man who believed that the pen was mightier than the sword. But he was up against two of the most powerful forces on the planet, the multi-billion-dollar multinational oil corporation Shell and the brutal military dictatorship of General Sani Abacha. In the 1990s, to speak against the Nigerian state was a suicide mission. But Ken Saro-Wiwa refused to be silent. He saw his people dying. He saw the fish floating belly up in the creeks. He saw children coughing up black soot. And he wrote about it. He sang about it. He mobilized 300,000 people to march peacefully against the environmental genocide. For this crime, the crime of asking for clean air and a fair share of the wealth, the state decided that he had to die. They didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to make an example of him. They wanted to stage a public execution so gruesome that no one would ever dare to speak against the oil giants again. This is the devastating, infuriating, and heartbreaking account of a judicial murder that shocked the world, and the botched hanging that proved that even death struggled to silence a righteous man. If you believe that freedom of speech is a right worth dying for, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand why a government would execute its most famous writer, you have to understand the geography of greed. Ogoniland is a small kingdom in the Niger Delta. Underneath its soil lies billions of dollars worth of crude oil. For decades, foreign companies extracted this wealth, pumping it out to fuel the cars and factories of the West. But the Ogoni people saw none of the money. Instead, they got the pollution. Gas flares burned night and day, turning the sky an apocalyptic orange. Acid rain destroyed the crops. The people lived in tin shacks with no electricity and no running water, literally sitting on top of a gold mine. Ken Saro-Wiwa founded MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. He wasn't violent. He used poetry. He used music. He used peaceful protests. He declared the oil companies persona non grata. And it worked. Shell was forced to pull out of Ogoniland in 1993. This was Ken's victory, but it was also his death warrant. The Nigerian military government, led by the ruthless General Sani Abacha, relied on oil revenues to maintain its grip on power. They could not afford to let one man stop the flow of money. They needed a reason to arrest him. They needed to frame him. In May 1994, 4 pro-government Ogoni chiefs were brutally murdered by a mob. Ken Saro-Wiwa was nowhere near the scene. He had famously preached nonviolence his entire life, but the government saw their opportunity. They arrested Ken and 8 other activists, accusing them of inciting the murders. It was a lie so transparent that the entire international community saw through it. But in a dictatorship, the truth is whatever the general says it is. Ken was thrown into a military detention cell. He was chained. He was tortured. He was denied access to his lawyers and his family. But even in the dark, chained to a wall, he kept writing. He smuggled notes out of prison in bread baskets and urine buckets. He wrote, "The most important thing for me is that I've used my talents as a writer to enable the Ogoni people to confront their tormentors. I am not a victim, I am a spirit." He believed that the world would save him. Nelson Mandela, Queen Elizabeth, and President Bill Clinton all pleaded for his life, but General Abacha was deaf to mercy. The trial was a sham. It wasn't held in a civilian court, it was a special military tribunal. The judges were hand-picked soldiers. The defense witnesses were bribed or threatened into silence. Ken was not allowed to speak in his own defense. On October 31, 1995, the tribunal delivered the verdict that had been written before the trial even began: death by hanging. Ken looked at the judges and famously said, "I repeat that we all stand before history. I am a man of peace, of ideas, appalled by the denigrating poverty of my people who live on a richly endowed land, distressed by their political marginalization and economic strangulation, angered by the devastation of their land. I have devoted my intellectual and material resources to a cause in which I have total belief." His words echoed around the world, but in Abuja, they were preparing the gallows. The execution was scheduled for November 10, 1995. The haste was terrifying. The government wanted him dead before the Commonwealth Summit began in New Zealand, a final act of defiance against the West. Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other 8 activists, the Ogoni 9, were taken to Port Harcourt Prison. They were dressed in white robes. They were led to the gallows. But what happened next turned a political execution into a horror movie. The executioner was drunk, or perhaps simply incompetent. Or maybe, as the locals believe, the spirits of the land were fighting back. When the trapdoor opened beneath Ken Saro-Wiwa, the rope snapped. He fell into the pit, alive. They dragged him up, they tied a new rope, they put the noose around his neck again. The lever was pulled. The machine malfunctioned. He fell again, still breathing, his neck bruised, but not broken. Imagine the psychological torture of that moment, standing on the edge of death, dropping into the void, only to wake up in the darkness of the pit, looking up at your executioners. Ken Saro-Wiwa, a man of immense dignity, reportedly looked at his captors after the second failure and said, "Why are you treating me this way? Which type of country is this? Even to kill a person, you cannot do it properly." It took 5 attempts to hang Ken Saro-Wiwa. 5 times the trapdoor opened. 5 times the machinery of death struggled to claim him. It was a gruesome, slow, and agonizing ordeal that lasted for hours. Finally, on the 5th attempt, the rope held. The voice of the Ogoni people was silenced. His body was not given to his family. To prevent his grave from becoming a shrine, the military poured acid on his remains and buried him in an unmarked mass grave in the prison cemetery. They thought that by dissolving his body, they would dissolve his message. They were wrong. This case raises a furious debate about the responsibility of corporations. Shell denied involvement, but they later paid $15.5 million to settle a lawsuit regarding the execution. I want to ask you, do you believe that multinational companies should be held criminally responsible when governments kill people to protect their profits? Or is business just business? I want to see your verdict in the comments. Also, Ken Saro-Wiwa had the chance to flee Nigeria before his arrest. He had a British passport. He could have lived a comfortable life in London as a celebrated author. Instead, he returned home to fight, knowing it would likely kill him. Is this kind of martyrdom bravery, or is it a tragic waste of a brilliant life? Would he have been more effective alive in exile writing books, or did his death ignite the cause more than his life ever could? The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa did not stop the pollution in the Niger Delta. In fact, it continues to this day. But his death stripped the mask off the Nigerian military dictatorship. They turned them into pariahs. Ken famously predicted the contest is between the pen and the gun, and the pen will win. 30 years later, General Abacha is dead and reviled as a thief and a tyrant. Ken Saro-Wiwa is studied in universities, his poetry is read by millions, and his name is synonymous with courage. The state killed the man, but they immortalized the martyr. He proved that you can snap a neck, but you cannot snap an idea. If this tragic story of the writer who was hanged 5 times left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure Ken's sacrifice is never forgotten. And make sure you are subscribed for Part 2, where we will travel back to the freezing winter of 1915 to uncover the story of a songwriter who was framed for murder and executed by a firing squad in Utah, famously giving the order to fire himself. This is the story of the man who never died.
Number 2. Joe Hill. We travel back in time to the freezing, smog-choked winter of Salt Lake City, Utah, in the year 1915. This is a story that takes place in the shadow of the copper mines, where the dust covered the lungs of the workers and the greed of the tycoons controlled the courts. This is the story of Joseph Hillstrom, known to the world as Joe Hill. He was not a pop star in the modern sense. He was a troubadour of the working class, a songwriter for the industrial workers of the world, the radical union known as the Wobblies. His songs were not played on radios. They were sung on picket lines, in hobo jungles, and in overcrowded jails. He wrote The Preacher and the Slave, coining the famous phrase, "You'll get pie in the sky when you die." He was a man who used humor and melody to fight for the rights of the poorest people in America. But to the state of Utah and the powerful copper bosses, Joe Hill was not a musician. He was a dangerous enemy. He was a voice that could incite a revolution. And so they decided to silence him, not with censorship, but with a firing squad. This is the infuriating and heartbreaking account of a kangaroo court, a framed murder charge, and a musician who stood against a wall, looked his executioners in the eye, and gave the order to fire. If you believe that the true history of rebellion deserves to be remembered, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the execution of Joe Hill, you have to understand the atmosphere of class war that gripped America in the early 20th century. It was a time of violence. Miners were being blown up in their shacks. Strikers were being beaten by the National Guard. Joe Hill arrived in Utah in 1913. He was a Swedish immigrant, a drifter, and a brilliant satirist. He worked in the mines, and he organized the men. His songs gave them courage. The authorities were watching him. They were waiting for a mistake. That mistake, or the opportunity to manufacture one, came on the night of January 10th, 1914. A grocer named John G. Morrison and his son were gunned down in their store by 2 masked intruders. "We've got you now," one of the killers allegedly shouted. It looked like a revenge killing, perhaps by a rival, as nothing was stolen. But the police didn't look for rivals. They looked for the troublemaker. That same night, Joe Hill had visited a doctor for a bullet wound in his chest. He claimed he had been in a fight over a woman, a dispute he refused to elaborate on to protect her honor. It was a coincidence, but for the state prosecutors, it was a golden ticket. Despite the fact that no one could positively identify Joe as the shooter in the grocery store, despite the fact that the bullet that killed Morrison did not match Joe's gun, and despite the fact that Joe knew none of the details of the grocery store layout, he was arrested and charged with double murder. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice. It was less a legal proceeding and more a public lynching. The newspapers painted him as a bloodthirsty anarchist. The judge refused to let him fire his incompetent lawyers. Joe Hill sat in the courtroom, watching the legal system dismantle his life with lies, realizing that he wasn't on trial for murder. He was on trial for his songs. For 22 months, Joe Hill sat on death row in the Utah State Prison. But something incredible happened. Instead of breaking him, The prison cell amplified him. He kept writing. He wrote songs about the prison guards, about the governor, about the system. His case became a global cause célèbre. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, intervened, asking the governor of Utah to reconsider the death sentence. The Swedish government pleaded for his life. Helen Keller wrote letters. Tens of thousands of workers marched in the streets from New York to San Francisco, demanding freedom for the man who wrote their anthems. But the governor of Utah, William Spray, was backed by the copper mining magnates. They wanted blood. They believed that killing Joe Hill would kill the Union movement. They denied all appeals. The date was set for November 19th, 1915. The night before his execution, Joe Hill wrote his last will and testament. It was not a legal document full of assets, for he had none. It was a poem. He wrote, "My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body? Oh, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let the merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again." It was the final artistic statement of a man who saw his death as a way to fertilize the movement he loved. He also sent a telegram to the Union leader Bill Haywood with a message that would become immortal. "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time in mourning. Organize." The morning of November 19th broke cold and clear over the Salt Lake Valley. Joe Hill was led into the prison yard. He was dressed in a suit. He was strapped into a chair against a wall. A white paper heart was pinned over his chest to give the riflemen a target. 5 men stood opposite him with rifles. One had a blank cartridge so that no man could be sure he fired the fatal shot. A psychological mercy for the killers, not the victim. Witnesses reported that Joe Hill was the calmest man in the courtyard. He smiled. He joked. When the officer in charge shouted, "Ready, aim," Joe Hill, in a final act of defiance, shouted the final command himself, "Fire." The volley of shots rang out. The paper heart was shredded. Joe Hill slumped forward. The state had killed the singer. But the aftermath proved that the governor had made a fatal miscalculation. They had wanted to silence him, but by executing him, they turned him into a martyr of mythical proportions. His body was sent to Chicago for the funeral. It was one of the largest funerals in American history. Over 30,000 people filled the streets, singing his songs, crying, and vowing revenge. As per his wishes, his body was cremated, and his ashes were placed in small envelopes and mailed to Union locals all over the world. His dust was scattered in every state in America, in Europe, in South America, and even in South Africa. The only state where his ashes were forbidden was Utah. The authorities there were so terrified of his ghost that they didn't want even a speck of his dust to remain within their borders. The execution of Joe Hill raises a terrifying question about the relationship between art and power. The state didn't fear Joe Hill's gun. They feared his melody. They feared his ability to make people feel brave. I want to ask you, do you believe that art is a weapon powerful enough to threaten a government? Can a song actually start a revolution, or was the paranoia of the Utah authorities unjustified? Furthermore, Joe Hill refused to testify at his own trial because he believed the burden of proof was on the state. He stood on principle, and it cost him his life. Is it noble to die for a principle, or should he have fought harder to save his own skin? I want to hear your thoughts on the price of integrity in the comments below. Joe Hill's conviction has been debated by historians for over a century. Most modern scholars believe he was innocent of the murder, a victim of a frame-up designed to decapitate the Union movement. But even if he was guilty, the trial was a sham. The tragedy is that the legal system was used as a weapon of political warfare. Joe Hill proved that the man can kill the body, but as the famous folk song says, "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me." He never really died. He just became the music. If this story of the songwriter who was executed by a firing squad left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure that the man who never died is remembered. And make sure you are subscribed for Part 3, where we will travel to the brutal regime of Turkey to uncover the story of a band that was banned, imprisoned, and starved to death simply for playing the wrong kind of folk music. This is the story of a hunger strike that shook the world.
Number 3. Grup Yorum. We cross the Atlantic and land in the historic volatile streets of Istanbul, Turkey. The year is 2020. This story is not about a sudden execution by a firing squad or a hangman's noose. It is about a much slower, more agonizing form of state-sponsored murder. It is about an execution carried out through silence, through indifference, and through the weaponization of hunger. This is the tragic story of Grup Yorum, a folk band that was not just a musical group, but a cultural institution. For 35 years, they sang songs about the working class, about justice, and about freedom. They filled soccer stadiums with fans who sang every word. They were the heartbeat of the Turkish left. But to the government, they were terrorists. Their instruments were smashed by police in raids. Their cultural centers were boarded up. Their members were thrown into prison lists. The state didn't just want to stop the music. They wanted to crush the spirit of the musicians. And so, 2 members of the band, Helen Bolek and Ibrahim Goshek, decided to fight back with the only weapon they had left, their own bodies. They declared a death fast. They refused to eat until they were allowed to sing again. This is the harrowing slow-motion tragedy of 2 artists who starved themselves to death in front of the whole world, demanding nothing more than the right to hold a concert, and a government that watched them die rather than lift a ban. If you believe that art is essential to the human soul, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the desperation of this act, you have to understand the level of persecution Grup Yorum faced. In Turkey, music is political. Grup Yorum combined traditional Turkish folk instruments with revolutionary lyrics. They were loved by the poor and feared by the powerful. Over the years, the Turkish state, increasingly authoritarian, tightened the noose. The government accused the band of having ties to the DHKPC, an outlawed Marxist group. The band denied being terrorists. They claimed they were simply artists reflecting the reality of their society. But the state didn't care about nuances. They raided the Idol Cultural Center, the band's headquarters, over 10 times in 2 years. Police officers would storm in, smash pianos with sledgehammers, break guitars, and arrest anyone inside. They placed bounties on the heads of the musicians, listing them on the gray list of wanted terrorists alongside bombers and assassins. They banned their concerts, silencing a voice that had been singing for 3 decades. Imagine being a musician and being told that playing a guitar is a crime against the state. Imagine having your life's work destroyed by a baton. Helen Bolek, the band's 28-year-old singer, and Ibrahim Goshek, the bassist, reached a breaking point. They realized that legal appeals were useless in a court system controlled by the regime. They realized that protests on the street were met with tear gas. So, in prison, they stopped eating. They demanded the release of their bandmates, the removal of the terror list designation, and the lifting of the concert ban. It was a simple list of demands. They weren't asking for a coup. They were asking to sing. When they were released from prison due to their deteriorating health, they didn't break their fast. They continued it at home, turning their bodies into a battlefield. The world watched in horror as they wasted away. Helen, once vibrant and full of life,
became a skeleton wrapped in skin. She lay in a bed too weak to speak, her eyes sunken, but her resolve ironclad. The images of them were difficult to look at, a stark visual accusation against the government's cruelty. Their mothers sat by their bedsides, pleading with the government to just let them sing so they could eat. But the government refused. They called the hunger strike a terrorist tactic. They refused to negotiate. They chose to let them die. On April 3, 2020, after 288 days without food, Helen Bolek passed away. She was 28 years old. She died not from a bullet, but from the sheer exhaustion of her heart, which had nothing left to pump. Her death sent shockwaves through Turkey and the international human rights community. But even her funeral was not allowed to be peaceful. Police blocked the roads, fired tear gas at the mourners, and arrested fans who tried to march with her coffin. It was a final act of disrespect by the state. 2 days after Helen's death, Ibrahim Goshek, who had been fasting for 332 days, decided to end his fast after the government hinted they might allow a concert permit. He was rushed to the hospital, a shadow of a man. But the damage to his body was irreversible. He died 2 days later on May 7, 2020. The state had effectively killed them both. They had pushed them into a corner where death was the only form of protest left. The ban on the band was technically a bureaucratic decision, but in reality, it was a death sentence. This case is terrifying because it forces us to confront the limits of peaceful protest. I want to ask you a difficult question. Do you consider this a suicide, or do you consider it state-sanctioned murder? When a government takes away a person's livelihood, their art, and their freedom, leaving them with no option but to starve, is the blood on the government's hands? Or do you think the musicians went too far by sacrificing their lives for a concert? I want to see a debate in the comments. Furthermore, the destruction of their instruments is a symbolic execution. Smashing a piano is an act of violence against culture. Do you think that destroying art is a sign of a weak government? Why are dictators always so afraid of singers and poets? Is it because a song can travel through walls that an army cannot cross? Let me know your thoughts on the power of music versus the power of the state. The tragedy of Grup Yorum is that they won, but the price was too high. Their deaths brought global attention to the censorship in Turkey. But Helen and Ibrahim are gone. They are martyrs of the folk music tradition, joining a long list of artists who died for their right to express themselves. They prove that you can ban a concert, you can smash a guitar, and you can lock up a singer, but you cannot kill the song. The song continues in the hearts of the millions who still listen to their records in secret. If this heartbreaking story of the band that starved to death for the right to sing left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to keep the memory of Helen and Ibrahim alive. And make sure you are subscribed for part 4, where we will travel to the war-torn mountains of Algeria to uncover the story of a rebel singer who was assassinated in a hail of 78 bullets because he dared to sing in his native language against both the government and the extremists. This is the story of the Lion of the Kabyle.
Number 4. Lounes Matoub. We travel to the rugged, sun-scorched peaks of the Kabylie Mountains in Algeria. The year is 1998. This is a story set against the backdrop of the Black Decade, a brutal civil war between the Algerian military state and Islamist insurgents that claimed over 150,000 lives. In this war, neutrality was impossible. You were either with the gun or against it. But there was one man who refused to pick a side, a man who chose a third path, the path of identity, culture, and absolute uncompromising truth. His name was Lounes Matoub. To his people, the Berbers or Amazigh, he was not just a singer. He was a prophet. He was the Lion of the Kabyle. He sang in his native Tamazahit language, a language the government tried to erase.
He sang against the religious extremists who wanted to turn Algeria into a theocracy, and he sang against the corrupt military generals who were looting the country. He was an enemy to everyone with a gun. And because he could not be bought, and he could not be silenced by fear, they decided to silence him with lead. This is the devastating, infuriating story of a man who survived kidnapping and torture only to be executed in a roadside ambush that sparked riots across the nation. To understand the magnitude of Lounes Matoub's bravery, you have to understand the danger he lived in. He was a walking target. In 1994, he had been kidnapped by the GIA, the armed Islamic group, the most ruthless terrorist organization in the country. They held him for 2 weeks. They sentenced him to death in a kangaroo court for the crime of being a secular artist. But the people of Kabylie rose up. Thousands marched, threatening to burn the country down if their son was not released. The terrorists, fearing a total uprising, let him go. Most men would have fled to France. Most men would have retired. But Lounes Matoub was not most men. He went back to the studio. He wrote a book called Rebel. He continued to live in his village, driving the mountain roads without a bodyguard, armed only with a Kalashnikov he kept in his trunk for protection. He famously said, "I prefer to die from my ideas than to die of old age in a bed." On June 25, 1998, his preference was granted. The ambush was military in its precision. It was a bright summer afternoon. Lounes was driving his black Mercedes along the winding mountain road of Tala Bunan. He was with his wife Nadia and her 2 sisters. They were heading home for lunch. But the road was a trap. As the car slowed down for a curve, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the bushes. Witnesses say there were between 6 and 8 gunmen. They didn't just shoot to disable the vehicle, they unleashed a storm of bullets. Lounes Matoub, realizing it was a hit, slammed on the brakes. He grabbed his gun. He yelled at his wife and sisters to get down. He tried to draw the fire away from them. He engaged the attackers, firing back, a lone singer fighting a death squad. But he was outgunned. The car was riddled with bullets. Lounes was hit multiple times. The fatal shot struck him, silencing the voice of the mountains. His wife and sisters were severely wounded, but miraculously survived. The killers vanished into the forest, leaving behind a smoking car and a martyred legend. The news of his death hit Algeria like a nuclear bomb. Within hours, the Kabylie region exploded. The youth poured into the streets. They burned government buildings. They chanted "Pouvoir assassin," the government is the killer. They didn't believe the official story that terrorists did it. They believed the state was complicit. They believed that the government, threatened by Matoub's influence and his push for Berber autonomy, had either organized the hit or allowed it to happen. The timing was too suspicious. The ambush was taking place in a heavily militarized zone where terrorists supposedly couldn't operate freely. The ambulance arrived late. The investigation was botched. To this day, the question hangs over Algeria. Who really killed Lounes Matoub? Was it the fundamentalists who hated his secularism, or was it the generals who hated his freedom? This assassination is terrifying because it shows that in a corrupt state, the middle ground is the kill zone. I want to ask you a question about cultural identity. Lounes Matoub died fighting for the right to sing in his own language. Do you believe that language and culture are things worth dying for? Is the preservation of one's heritage the ultimate act of resistance? Or was he reckless to stay in a war zone? I want to hear your thoughts on the price of heritage. Furthermore, the public immediately blamed the government despite the Islamist insurgents claiming responsibility. What does it say about a country when the people automatically assume their own government murdered their national hero? Does this level of distrust prove that the state was illegitimate? Let me know your verdict on the pouvoir assassin theory. Lounes Matoub's funeral was attended by tens of thousands. His grave, located in his garden, is a shrine. His songs are still the anthems of the Berber identity movement across North Africa. He proved that you can riddle a Mercedes with 78 bullets, but you cannot kill the spirit of a people. He was the rebel who never knelt. If this tragic story of the lion who fought an army alone left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure that Lounes Matoub is remembered beyond the borders of Algeria. And make sure you are subscribed for Part 5, where we will travel to the streets of Athens, Greece, to uncover the story of an anti-fascist rapper who was stabbed to death by a neo-Nazi gang in plain view of the police. This is the story of the murder that exposed a political conspiracy.
Number 5. Pavlos Fyssas. We travel to the cradle of democracy, Athens, Greece, to witness how a modern European state allowed a neo-Nazi paramilitary group to hunt down and execute a singer in the middle of the street. The year is 2013. Greece was in the grip of a catastrophic economic depression. Unemployment was skyrocketing, poverty was rampant, and in this vacuum of despair, a monster was rising. The Golden Dawn, a far-right political party with a swastika-like emblem, was gaining power. They were not just politicians in suits. They were a criminal organization with stormtroopers who patrolled the streets in black shirts, beating immigrants, leftists, and anyone who didn't fit their vision of a pure Greece. Standing against them was a 34-year-old hip-hop artist named Pavlos Fyssas, known by his stage name Killa P. He was a working-class hero from the neighborhood of Karatsini. His songs were not about money or fame, they were about anti-fascism, solidarity, and the struggles of the poor. He used his rhymes to expose the hate that Golden Dawn was spreading. To the fascists, a rapper with a microphone was more dangerous than a politician with a speech, because Pavlos spoke the language of the youth. They couldn't debate him, so they decided to assassinate him. This is the terrifying story of a coordinated military-style hit carried out in plain view of the police. A murder that ripped the mask off a political party and revealed it to be a gang of murderers. If you believe that music is the ultimate weapon against tyranny, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the horror of that night, you have to understand the atmosphere of terror in Athens. Golden Dawn operated like a shadow government. They had hit squads. On the night of September 17, 2013, Pavlos Fyssas was at a cafe called Coral in his home neighborhood, watching a soccer match with his girlfriend and a few friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening, but Pavlos had been marked. Spies for Golden Dawn spotted him in the cafe. They didn't confront him immediately. Instead, they sent a text message to the local party hierarchy. The message was simple and chilling. The target is here. Within minutes, a digital chain of command was activated. Calls were made, messages were sent. A battalion of Golden Dawn shock troops began to gather. They arrived on motorcycles and in cars, dressed in black military fatigues, wielding clubs and knives. They waited outside the cafe like a pack of wolves. When Pavlos tried to leave, he walked into an ambush. The attack was not a chaotic brawl. It was a strategic execution. As Pavlos stepped out, he was surrounded by dozens of armed men. He tried to protect his girlfriend and friends, shouting at them to run while he held the line. He fought back, using his fists to keep the mob at bay. But while the mob distracted him, the executioner arrived. Georgios Roupakias, a high-ranking member of Golden Dawn, drove up to the scene, stepped out of his car, and walked calmly toward the rapper. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He bypassed the fight, walked straight to Pavlos, and stabbed him twice in the chest and once in the thigh. The coroner later testified that the blows were professional. They were struck with a twisting motion designed to cause maximum internal damage and ensure death. Pavlos collapsed on the pavement, his blood staining the streets of the neighborhood he loved. But the most shocking part of this story is not the stabbing.
It is the audience. A squad of Greek police officers from the Dias motorcycle unit was present at the scene. They were armed. They witnessed the mob gathering. They witnessed the assault. And they did nothing. They stood by and watched as a citizen was lynched. It was only after Pavlos was stabbed that they approached. With his dying breath, Pavlos pointed at Roupakias and told the officers he did it. Even in death, he was identifying his killer, ensuring justice. The murder of Pavlos Fissas was the spark that burned Golden Dawn to the ground. For years, the Greek state had turned a blind eye to their violence, often because elements of the police force sympathized with their ideology. But the public execution of a popular Greek singer was a line they could not uncross. The country exploded in rage. Thousands of anti-fascist protesters flooded the streets of Athens, clashing with police and demanding justice. The government, fearing a total collapse of order, finally acted. They raided the Golden Dawn headquarters. They arrested the party leadership, including members of parliament, and charged them with running a criminal organization. The trial that followed was one of the most significant in European history. It lasted 5 years. It revealed that the murder of Kilapi was not a random act of violence by a rogue supporter, but a sanctioned hit ordered by the party hierarchy. In 2020, the court declared Golden Dawn a criminal organization and sentenced its leaders to prison. Pavlos Fissas had defeated the fascists, but he had to die to do it. This case forces us to confront the complicity of the authorities. I want to ask you a serious question about law enforcement. The police stood by and watched Pavlos die. Do you believe they were scared of the mob, or do you think they sympathized with the attackers? When the police refuse to protect citizens from political violence, does the state lose its legitimacy? Furthermore, Pavlos used hip-hop to fight fascism. Do you believe that rap music is a legitimate form of political resistance? Can a genre often associated with materialism also be a tool for revolution? I want to hear your thoughts on the power of the microphone in the comments below. Also, Golden Dawn was a legally elected political party with seats in parliament. Should democracies ban political parties that promote hate, or does banning them only drive them underground and make them more dangerous? Where is the line between free speech and hate speech? Pavlos Fissas is now a legend in Greece. There is a monument erected on the spot where he died. His lyrics are spray-painted on walls across Europe. He proved that you can stab a man, but you cannot kill the movement he represents. He was the rapper who fought an army with nothing but his rhymes and his fists. If this tragic story of the anti-fascist rapper who exposed a conspiracy left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to keep Kilapi's message alive. And make sure you are subscribed for part 6, where we will travel to the totalitarian regime of Cambodia to uncover the story of a golden-voiced singer who disappeared into the killing fields, erased by a regime that outlawed love songs. This is the story of the voice that vanished into the silence of genocide.
Number 6. Sinn Sisamouth. We travel to the humid tropical heat of Cambodia in the mid-1970s to witness one of the most terrifying cultural genocides in human history. This is not just the story of the murder of a man, it is the story of the attempted murder of music itself. The year is 1975. The Khmer Rouge, led by the fanatical dictator Pol Pot, has seized control of the country. They declared Year Zero, a twisted social experiment designed to wipe away history, modernity, and emotion. They wanted to turn Cambodia into an agrarian utopia of peasant workers. To do this, they decided to eliminate anyone who was educated, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone who wore glasses, and anyone who created art. In this nightmare, a singer was considered an enemy of the state, and the biggest enemy of all was Sinn Sisamouth. He was known as the King of Khmer music, the Elvis of Cambodia.
He was a man with a velvet voice who combined traditional Cambodian melodies with Western rock and roll and French pop. He was the soundtrack of a nation's soul. But to the Khmer Rouge, his songs about love, romance, and heartbreak were capitalist poisons that weakened the revolutionary spirit. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him erased from memory. This is the heartbreaking, legendary account of a superstar forced into a concentration camp and the final song he sang before the executioners turned the lights out on the Pearl of Asia. If you believe that a nation without music is a nation without a soul, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the tragedy of Sinn Sisamouth, you have to imagine the Cambodia that existed before the darkness fell. Phnom Penh in the 1960s was a vibrant, psychedelic city. It was the cultural capital of Southeast Asia. Sinn Sisamouth was its golden boy. He was a prolific genius, writing thousands of songs, his voice blasting from every radio, every cafe, and every tuk-tuk. He was a doctor by training, a gentleman who sang about the beauty of the Mekong River and the pain of lost love. But on April 17, 1975, the music stopped. The Khmer Rouge marched into the city. They ordered the evacuation of everyone. Millions of people were forced to walk into the countryside to work in the killing fields. Sinn Sisamouth joined the exodus. He knew that if the soldiers discovered who he was, he would be killed instantly. He stripped off his stage clothes. He likely broke his glasses. He walked among the masses, pretending to be a simple laborer. For months, the most famous voice in the country remained silent, hiding in the mud, starving alongside his fans who didn't recognize the broken man next to them. But fame is a curse in a small country. Eventually, the secret came out. There are many stories about how he was discovered. Some say he was recognized by a soldier who used to be a fan. Others say he was betrayed by an informant seeking extra rations. Regardless of how it happened, the result was the same. He was arrested and brought before a local Khmer Rouge cadre. In the twisted logic of the regime, his fame was proof of his corruption. He was a symbol of the old society that had to be destroyed. He was sentenced to death without a trial. But it is the manner of his death that has become a legend, a story passed down in whispers by survivors. According to the most enduring account, Sinn Sisamouth did not beg for his life. He knew there was no mercy in the killing fields. Instead, he made one final request. He asked the soldiers for permission to sing one last song. The soldiers, perhaps bored or perhaps curious to hear the voice they had grown up with, agreed. Sinn Sisamouth stood before the open pit that would become his grave. He didn't sing a revolutionary anthem. He didn't sing a song of anger. He sang a ballad about the beauty of Cambodia, about the love for his family and his people. His voice, even after months of starvation, was pure and powerful. It is said that the soldiers were moved to tears, their brainwashing momentarily cracked by the undeniable humanity of the music. But in the killing fields, emotion was a weakness. When the song finished, the moment of connection ended. The soldiers, fearful of being reported for showing leniency, raised their shovels or their rifles. They killed him mid-melody or immediately after the final note. There is no grave marker for Sinn Sisamouth. His body was thrown into a mass grave, mixed with the bones of thousands of others. The regime then went on a rampage to destroy his legacy. They burned the master tapes of his recordings. They smashed the vinyl records. They executed other singers, like Rose Siré Sothea. They tried to create a silence so absolute that the future would never know that Cambodia once sang. This case is terrifying because it shows how fragile civilization is. I want to ask you a question about the power of art. The Khmer Rouge tried to physically destroy the music by burning the tapes and killing the sinner. Yet, Sinn Sisamouth is more popular today in Cambodia than ever before. Do you believe that art is truly immortal? Can you kill a singer, but not the song? Or did the genocide successfully rob Cambodia of its cultural future? I want to hear your thoughts on cultural resilience. Furthermore, the story of him asking to sing before his execution is heartbreaking. If you were in his place, knowing you were about to die, would you use your last moments to do the thing you loved, or would you fight? Is his final song an act of defiance or an act of acceptance? Let me know in the comments. Also, we often take music for granted. Can you imagine living in a world where singing a love song is punishable by death? Does this story make you appreciate the freedom of expression we have today? Sinn Sisamouth's voice survived because ordinary people risked their lives to hide his cassette tapes. They buried them in the ground. They hid them in hollow trees. They preserved the soul of their nation while the world around them burned. Today, his voice is the ghost that haunts the killing fields, a reminder of the beauty that was lost and the resilience that remains. He was the king who died in the mud, but he reigns forever in the airwaves. If you believe that a nation without music is a nation without a soul, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. And make sure you are subscribed for Part 7, where we will travel to the brutal military dictatorship of Chile to witness the final moments of a folk singer who had his hands smashed by soldiers in a stadium so he could never play the guitar again before being riddled with machine gun fire. This is the story of the guitar of the revolution.
Number 7. Fela Kuti. We traveled to the chaotic, sweltering streets of Lagos, Nigeria in the year 1977. This is not a story of a secret assassination in the dead of night. This is a story of a full-scale military invasion. It is the story of what happens when a singer becomes so powerful, so influential, and so dangerous to the establishment that the government sends an entire army battalion to silence him. Fela Kuti was not just a musician. He was a force of nature. He was the creator of Afrobeat, a hypnotic blend of jazz, funk, and African rhythms. He was a superstar who lived in a commune he declared an independent country called the Calcutta Republic. He was a man who smoked giant spliffs on stage, married 27 wives in a single ceremony, and used his songs to mock the corrupt Nigerian military junta. He didn't use metaphors. He named names. He called the soldiers zombies. And in February 1977, the zombies came for him. The state didn't send a hitman. They sent 1,000 armed soldiers. They didn't just want to arrest him. They wanted to burn his kingdom to the ground. This is the horrifying, chaotic, and heroic account of the day the Nigerian army declared war on a pop star, resulting in the murder of his mother and the destruction of his life's work. If you believe that a true artist never bows to a tyrant, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the rage of the Nigerian government, you have to listen to the song Zombie. Released in 1976, it was a massive hit. The song mocked soldiers as mindless robots who only followed orders to kill their own people. Zombie no go go, unless you tell him to go. Zombie no go think, unless you tell him to think. The lyrics were broadcast from speakers all over Africa. The soldiers were humiliated in the streets. General Olusegun Obasanjo, the military head of state, was furious. Fela had crossed a line. He was no longer just a nuisance. He was a threat to military discipline. On February 18, 1977, the order was given. The Calcutta Republic, Fela's compound, which housed his family, his band, and his recording studio, was surrounded. The attack was a massacre in slow motion. 1,000 soldiers cordoned off the neighborhood. They cut the electricity. They stormed the gates. Fela Kuti, ever the rebel, had electrified the fence, but the power was cut. The soldiers poured in like a flood of green uniforms. They were not there to keep the peace. They were there to inflict pain.
They beat the men, they assaulted the women, they smashed the recording equipment, destroying master tapes of unreleased music, a cultural erasure similar to what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. Fela was beaten unconscious. He was dragged by his hair, his skull fractured, his body broken. But the cruelest act was reserved for the most fragile person in the house, Fela's mother. Funmilayo Ransom Kuti was 77 years old. She was not just a musician's mother, she was a national hero in her own right, a feminist activist who had fought for Nigeria's independence from Britain. She was known as the Lioness of Lisabi. When the soldiers stormed the house, they found her in an upstairs room. They didn't show her respect, they didn't show her mercy. In a moment of pure, savage brutality, unknown soldiers picked up the 77-year-old woman and threw her out of a second-story window. She crashed onto the concrete below. She suffered a broken leg and severe internal injuries. She lapsed into a coma and died a few months later from the trauma. The state had killed the mother to break the son. The aftermath was a masterclass in government gaslighting. Fela, broken and battered, sued the government for millions. He demanded justice for his mother and his property. The government set up an official inquiry. The result? The inquiry concluded that the Kalakuta Republic was burned down by an unknown soldier. No one was punished, no one was fired. The government claimed that 1,000 men had gathered, burned a house, and killed a woman, but somehow nobody knew who they were. It was a slap in the face to justice. But Fela Kuti did not crumble. In an act of supreme defiance that is now legendary, he took his mother's coffin and marched it to the Doden Barracks, the official residence of General Obasanjo. He demanded that the general accept the body of the woman his soldiers had killed. Then he wrote one of his greatest songs, Unknown Soldier, documenting the tragedy and the cover-up. He famously sang, "Them kill my mama, political cutie, unknown soldier." This case is terrifying because of the sheer scale of the violence. I want to ask you a question about power. When a government sends 1,000 soldiers to attack one singer, does it show their strength or does it reveal their terrifying weakness? Were they afraid that Fela's music was actually more powerful than their tanks? Furthermore, Fela refused to leave Nigeria even after this. He stayed and continued to sing until his death. Is this kind of resilience inspiring, or was he reckless with the lives of his family? Should he have exiled himself to protect his mother and his wives? I want to hear your thoughts on the cost of revolution in the comments. Also, the phrase unknown soldier became a symbol of lack of accountability. Do we still see unknown soldiers today, agents of the state who commit crimes and hide behind the badge? Let me know your verdict. Fela Kuti lost his house, his fortune, and his mother, but he never lost his voice. He proved that you can burn a compound, but you cannot burn the truth. He turned his trauma into a groove that the whole world dances to. He was the president of the Republic of Music, and he remains undefeated. If this tragic story of the Afrobeat legend who went to war with an army left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video to ensure the unknown soldier is finally known. And make sure you are subscribed for Part 8, where we will travel to the Cold War era of East Berlin to uncover the mysterious death of the Red Elvis, an American rock star who defected to the Soviet Union, became a socialist icon, and was found dead in a lake under suspicious circumstances. Was it suicide, or was it a hit by the secret police? This is the spy thriller of the music world.
Number 8. Dean Reed. We travel to the heart of the Cold War, to the divided city of East Berlin behind the Iron Curtain. The year is 1986. This is the strangest, most cinematic, and most mysterious story on our list. It is the story of a man who was a ghost in his own country, but a god in the Soviet Union. Dean Reed was a handsome, blue-eyed cowboy from Colorado. He was an American pop singer who had a modest career in Hollywood. But in the communist world, he was bigger than Elvis Presley. He was known as the Red Elvis. He was a socialist who defected to the East,
believing that the Soviet system was the future of humanity. He sang protest songs, starred in communist propaganda films, and was the poster boy for the anti-American propaganda machine. He lived a life of luxury in East Germany, protected by the state, loved by the masses, and watched by the spies. But being a trophy for a totalitarian regime comes with a deadly price. When the Red Elvis stopped being useful, or when he started missing the freedom of the West, the state that made him decided his fate. Dean Reed didn't die of old age. He was found dead in a lake, fully clothed, under circumstances that scream of a cover-up. This is the Cold War spy thriller of a naive idealist who walked into a trap he couldn't sing his way out of. If you believe that the truth is often stranger than fiction, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. To understand the mystery of Dean Reed, you have to understand the paranoia of East Germany. The country was run by the Stasi, the secret police who had files on almost every citizen. Dean Reed was their golden goose. He was proof that Americans hated capitalism. He played to sold-out stadiums in Moscow, Chile, and Prague. He was personal friends with Erich Honecker, the dictator of East Germany. But by 1986, the dream was turning into a nightmare. Dean was 47 years old. His fame was fading. He was homesick. He recently appeared on the American TV show 60 Minutes, hoping to explain his politics to his countrymen. Instead, he was ripped apart. The American public called him a traitor. He received bags of hate mail. He was devastated. He realized that he was a man without a country, hated in the West, and becoming a relic in the East. He reportedly began talking about returning to the United States, about leaving the golden cage the Soviets had built for him. This was a problem for the Stasi. A defecting American was a propaganda victory. A returning defector would be a propaganda disaster. If Dean Reed went back to Colorado and told the world that life in the Soviet Union was miserable, it would be a humiliating blow to the communist regime. On the night of June 13, 1986, Dean Reed disappeared. He'd argued with his wife, Renate Blum, a famous East German actress who was allegedly, and unknowingly to Dean, reporting on him to the Stasi. He drove his Lada car to the Zeutner See, a lake near his home on the outskirts of Berlin. 5 days later, his body was found floating in the shallow water. The official story released by the East German government was accidental drowning. Then it changed to suicide. They claimed he slashed his wrists and then overdosed on sleeping pills before walking into the lake. They even found a suicide note written on the back of a script in his car, a note that was conveniently addressed to General Secretary Erich Honecker, apologizing for his weakness. It read like a political confession, not a personal goodbye. But the details didn't add up. Dean was a strong swimmer. The water was shallow. His family in America and many of his friends in Germany never believed the suicide theory. They believed he was suicided by the Stasi. The theory is that the secret police knew he was planning to leave. They couldn't arrest him because he was a national hero, so they silenced him. They drugged him, dumped him in the lake, and forged the note to protect the image of the state. It was a clean, quiet removal of a political liability. This case is terrifying because it illustrates the ultimate trap of authoritarianism. I want to ask you a question about loyalty. Dean Reed betrayed his country to follow his beliefs. Do you see him as a traitor who got what he deserved? Or a naive idealist who was used and destroyed by a cynical government? Is there sympathy for a man who supports a dictatorship? Furthermore, the suicide note was kept secret for years and only released after the Berlin Wall fell. Do you trust the official reports of a government that relies on secret police? Or do you assume foul play whenever a dissident or a defector dies? I want to hear your verdict on the Stasi's involvement. Also, Dean wanted to go home. Do you think America would have forgiven him if he had returned? Or was he doomed to be an outcast in both worlds? Let me know in the comments. Dean Reed's death marked the beginning of the end for East Germany. 3 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. Dean is largely forgotten in the US, but in Russia and Germany, he is still a cult figure. He proved that you can cross the Iron Curtain,
but you can never truly be free if you are a pawn in someone else's game. He was the cowboy who rode east and drowned in the politics of the Cold War. If this mysterious story of the American star who died in a communist lake left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with any history buffs you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 9, where we will travel to the modern streets of Ethiopia to uncover the assassination of a singer whose death didn't just silence a song, it started a civil war. This is the story of the voice that ignited a nation.
Number 9. Hachalu Hundessa. We travel to the Horn of Africa, to the ancient and volatile capital of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The year is 2020. This story is a terrifying example of how a single voice can become so powerful that it shakes the foundations of a government, and how silencing that voice can burn a country to the ground. Hachalu Hundessa was not just a pop star. He was the soundtrack of a revolution. He was the voice of the Oromo people, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, who had felt marginalized and oppressed for decades. His songs were not about parties or romance. They were anthems of resistance. They were about land rights, about justice, and about dignity. In 2018, his music fueled a wave of protests that actually led to the resignation of the prime minister and a change in government. Think about that power. A singer who brought down a regime with his guitar. But in the murky waters of Ethiopian politics, power makes you a target. On a rainy night in June, Hachalu Hundessa was hunted down. The state didn't arrest him this time. He was assassinated in a calculated hit that felt like a spark thrown into a powder keg. This is the devastating story of a murder that triggered a civil war, of riots, leading to hundreds of deaths, and an internet blackout that plunged a nation into darkness. To understand why Hachalu was a walking target, you have to listen to his song Malanjira, What Existence Is Mine. It has millions of views. It questioned the displacement of Oromo farmers. He was fearless. He had been imprisoned at the age of 17 for his activism, spending 5 years in jail. He knew the risks. In the weeks leading up to his death, he reported receiving death threats. He told a television network that there were people plotting against him, powerful people who wanted to silence the symbol of Oromo pride. On the night of June 29, 2020, Hachalu was driving his car through the Gelen condominiums area of Addis Ababa. It was around 9:30 p.m. He was heading home to his wife and daughters, but he never made it. The assassination was professional and brutal. Gunmen approached his vehicle. They didn't rob him. They fired shots directly into his chest. Hachalu was rushed to the Turkish Beijing General Hospital, but the damage was done. The voice of the revolution took his last breath. As the news spread on social media, the reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Hachalu wasn't just a singer. He was a brother to millions. The grief turned into a rage that the government could not control. The morning after his death, Ethiopia exploded. Youths poured into the streets of Addis Ababa and cities across the Oromia region. They burned tires, they toppled statues, they attacked government buildings. The chanting was deafening. They killed Hachalu. The government responded with an iron fist. They deployed the military. They shut down the internet for the entire country, cutting off 100 million people from the outside world to stop the spread of the protests. For weeks, Ethiopia was in chaos. In the crackdown and the riots that followed, over 160 people were killed. Opposition leaders were arrested. The assassination of one singer had destabilized the entire Horn of Africa. The government blamed rebel groups, the rebels blamed the government. Conspiracies swirled that he was killed by the state to provoke a crisis that would allow them to arrest opposition leaders, a false flag operation paid for in the blood of a musician. This case is terrifying because it proves that a song can be more dangerous than a bomb. I want to ask you a question about influence. Hachalu's death caused a semi-civil war. Do you believe that any artist today in the West has that kind of power? Is there a singer whose death would cause a nation to burn?
Or is this unique to places where freedom is fragile? Furthermore, the internet shutdown was a tactic to hide the violence. Do you think access to the internet is a human right? Or does the government have the right to pull the plug to stop riots? Was it crowd control or a cover-up? I want to hear your verdict. Also, Hachalu knew they were coming for him, but he refused to leave Ethiopia. Was staying in Addis Ababa an act of ultimate bravery, or should he have led the movement from the safety of exile? Does a leader have to die to become a legend? Hachalu Hundessa is buried in his hometown of Ambo. His statue stands tall, but his true monument is the political consciousness of his people. He proved that you can shoot the singer, but the echo of the gunshot will only make the song louder. He was the Lion of Oromia, who roared until the very end.
Number 10. Osip Mandelstam. We end our journey in the frozen hellscape of a Soviet transit camp near Vladivostok, on the far edge of Russia. The year is 1938. This is the era of the Great Purge, where Joseph Stalin's paranoia turned the Soviet Union into a graveyard. In this system, you didn't need to hold a gun to be considered dangerous. You just needed to hold a pen. Osip Mandelstam was not a rock star with a guitar. He was something far more terrifying to a dictator. A poet, with a voice that cut through the propaganda like a knife. He was one of the greatest literary minds of the 20th century, a man whose verses were memorized and recited like sacred songs by the oppressed. But Osip Mandelstam committed the ultimate sin. He didn't write a manifesto, he didn't start a riot. He simply wrote a short satirical poem, a 16-line verse that mocked Stalin's thick fingers and cockroach whiskers. For those 16 lines, the entire machinery of the Soviet superpower was mobilized to crush him. This is the haunting, freezing story of a genius who was erased from history, starved to death in a gulag, and dumped in a mass grave, all because he dared to make fun of a tyrant. To feel the weight of this tragedy, you have to understand the power of the Stalin epigram. In 1933, Mandelstam attended a small private gathering of friends. He stood up and recited a new poem. It wasn't written down, it was only in his head. He described Stalin as the Kremlin Highlander, a murderer who rolls the executions on his tongue like berries. He mocked the dictator's appearance and his cruelty. The guests were terrified. One of them, a mole for the secret police, reported him. The poem was treated as an act of terrorism. Stalin himself reportedly took a personal interest in the case, calling Pasternak to ask, "Is he a master?" He wanted to know if the man he was about to destroy was a genius. When the answer was yes, the order was given: isolate but preserve. At first, he was exiled. But in 1938, as the purge intensified, the mercy ended. He was arrested again, charged with counter-revolutionary activities, and sentenced to 5 years in the Gulag. Osip Mandelstam was 47 years old, but he looked 80. He was frail, suffering from a heart condition, and terrified. He was put on a cattle train and shipped across the continent to the Second River Transit Camp in Vladivostok, a holding pen for prisoners waiting to be shipped to the gold mines of Kolyma, a place from which no one returned. The conditions were medieval. Prisoners slept in sub-zero temperatures with no blankets. They were fed watery soup and frozen bread. Mandelstam, the man who had written about the beauty of architecture and the soul of Rome, was reduced to scavenging for garbage heaps. Witnesses say he was hallucinating, reciting his poems to the wind, terrified that the guards were trying to poison his food. On December 27, 1938, his heart finally gave out. He died of typhoid and starvation. The indignity of his death is shattering. There was no funeral. There was no moment of silence. His naked body was reportedly tossed onto a pile of corpses like firewood. He was buried in a mass grave, just a number on a list. For decades, his name was banned in the Soviet Union. His wife, Nadezhda Mandelstam, spent her life memorizing his unpublished poems, keeping them alive in her brain because writing them down was too dangerous. She became a living library, ensuring that while the state killed the poet, they could not kill the poetry. This case is the ultimate proof of the fragility of tyrants. I want to ask you a question about censorship. Stalin commanded the largest army in the world, yet he was afraid of a 16-line poem. Why are dictators so insecure that a joke can be a capital offense? Does this prove that art is the one thing power cannot control? Furthermore, Mandelstam knew the risk. He reportedly said, "Poetry is respected only in this country. People are killed for it." Was reciting that poem an act of suicide? Or was it the only way he could keep his dignity? Is it better to stay silent and live, or speak the truth and die? I want to hear your philosophy in the comments. Also, Nadezhda Mandelstam saved his work by memorizing it. In the digital age, do we still value memory? If the internet was shut down tomorrow, would our culture survive, or would it vanish? Let me know your thoughts on the permanence of art. Osip Mandelstam died in the ice, nameless and freezing. But today, Stalin's statues are torn down and Mandelstam's poems are taught in schools. He proved that the winter eventually ends, but the word remains. He was the voice that froze the blood of the Kremlin. This concludes our investigation into the 10 musicians and voices executed by the state. We have traveled from the firing squads of Utah to the hanging pits of Nigeria, from the killing fields of Cambodia to the gulags of Russia. We have seen that the most dangerous thing a person can possess is a microphone and a conscience. If this series opened your eyes to the price of freedom, please hit the like button and share this video with every music fan and history buff you know. And make sure you are subscribed and have the bell turned on. We have a massive new investigation starting next week that digs into the 10 music legends who died broke and alone, exposing how the industry drains its stars dry. You do not want to miss it.